Lily had seen little of Rosedale since her illuminating talk with Mrs. Fisher, but on the two or three occasions when they had met, she was conscious of having distinctly advanced in his favour. There could be no doubt that he admired her as much as ever, and she believed it rested with herself to raise his admiration to the point where it should bear down the lingering counsels of expediency. The task was not an easy one, but neither was it easy. The long but ne- the task was not an easy one, but neither was it easy in her long sleepless nights to face the thought of what George Dorset was so clearly ready to offer. Baseness for baseness, she hated the other least. There were even moments when a marriage with Rosedale seemed the only honourable solution of her difficulties. She did not indeed let her imagination range beyond the day of plighting. After that everything faded into a haze of material well-being, in which the personality of her benefactor remained mercifully vague. She had learned, in her long vigils, that there were certain things not good to think of, certain midnight images that must at any cost be exorcised, and one of these was the image of herself as Rosedale's wife. Carrie Fisher, on the strength, as she frankly owned, of the Bryces' Newport success, had taken for the autumn months a small house at Tuxedo, and thither Lily was bound on the Sunday after Dorset's visit. Though it was nearly dinner time when she arrived, her hostess was still out, and the firelight quiet of the small silent house descended on her spirit with a sense of peace and familiarity. It may be doubted if such an emotion had ever before been evoked by Carrie Fisher's surroundings, but, contrasted to the world in which Lily had lately lived, there was an air of repose and stability in the very placing of the furniture, and in the quiet competence of the parlour maid who led her up to her room. Mrs. Fisher's unconventionality was, after all, a mere superficial divergence from an inherited social creed, while the manners of the Gormer circle represented their first attempt to formulate such a creed for themselves. It was the first time since her return from Europe that Lily had found herself in a congenial atmosphere, and the stirrings of familiar associations had almost prepared her, as she descended the stairs before dinner, to enter upon a group of her old acquaintances. But this expectation was instantly checked by the reflection that the friends who remained loyal were precisely those who would be least willing to expose her to such encounters, and it was hardly with surprise that she found, instead, Mr. Rosedale kneeling domestically on the drawing-room hearth before his hostess's little girl. Rosedale, in the paternal role, was hardly a figure to soften Lily, yet she could not but notice a quality of homely goodness in his advances to the child. They were not, at any rate, the premeditated and perfunctory endearments of the guests under his hostess' eyes, for he and the little girl had the room to themselves, and something in his attitude made him seem a simple and kindly being compared to the small critical creature who endured his homage. Yes, he would be kind, Lily from the threshold had time to feel, kind in his gross, unscrupulous, rapacious way, the way of the predatory creature with his mate. She had but a moment in which to consider whether this glimpse of the fireside man mitigated her repugnance, or gave it, rather, a more concrete and intimate form. For at the sight of her he was immediately on his feet again, the florid and dominant Rosedale of Mattie Gormer's drawing-room. It was no surprise to Lily to find that he had been selected as her only fellow guest. Though she and her hostess had not met since the latter's tentative discussion of her future, Lily knew that the acuteness which enabled Mrs. Fisher to lay a safe and pleasant course through a world of antagonistic forces was not unfrequently exercised for the benefit of her friends. It was, in fact, characteristic of Carrie that, while she actively gleaned her own stores from the fields of affluence, her real sympathies were on the other side, with the unlucky, the unpopular, the unsuccessful, with all her hungry fellow toilers in the shorn stubble of success. Mrs. Fisher's experience guarded her against the mistake of exposing Lily for the first evening to the unmitigated impression of Rosedale's personality. Kate Corby and the two or three men dropped in to dinner, and Lily, alive to every detail of her friend's method, saw that such opportunities as had been contrived for her were to be deferred till she had, as it were, gained courage to make effectual use of them. She had a sense of acquiescence in this plan, with the passiveness of a sufferer resigned to the surgeon's touch. And this feeling of almost lethargic helplessness continued when, after the departure of the guests, Mrs. Fisher followed her upstairs. "May I come in and smoke a cigarette over your fire? If we talk in my room, we shall disturb the child." Mrs. Fisher looked about her with an eye of the solicitous hostess. "I hope you've managed to make yourself comfortable, dear. Isn't it a jolly little house? It's such a blessing to have a few quiet weeks with the baby." Carrie, in her rare moments of prosperity, became so expansively maternal that Miss Bart sometimes wondered whether, if she could ever get time and money enough, she would not end by devoting them both to her daughter. "It's a well-earned rest, I'll say that for myself," she continued, sinking down with a sigh of content on the pillow lounge near the fire. "Louisa Bry is a stern taskmaster. I've often used to wish myself back with the Gomers. Talk of love-making people, jealous and suspicious. It's nothing to social ambition. Louisa used to lie awake at night wondering whether the woman who called on me because I was with her, or on her because she was with me, and she was always laying traps to find out what I thought. Of course, I had to disown my oldest friends, rather than let her suspect she owed me the chance of making a single acquaintance, when, all the while, that was what she had me there for, and what she wrote me a handsome check for when the season was over." Mrs. Fisher was not a woman who talked of herself without cause, and the practice of direct speech, far from precluding in her an occasional resort to circuitous methods, served rather as at crucial moments the purpose of the juggler's chatter while he sifts the contents of his sleeve. Through the haze of her cigarette smoke she continued to gaze meditatively at Miss Bart, who, having dismissed her maid, sat before the toilet table, shaking out over her shoulders the loosened undulations of her hair. "Your hair's wonderful, Lily. Thinner? What does that matter, when it's so light and alive? So many women's worries seem to go straight to their hair, but yours looks as if there has never been an anxious thought under it. I never saw you look better than you did this evening. Matty Gormer told me that Morpeth wanted to paint you. Why don't you let him?" Miss Bart's immediate answer was to address a critical glance to the reflection of the countenance under discussion. Then she said, with a slight touch of irritation, "I don't care to accept a portrait from Paul Morpeth." Miss Fisher mused. "No, and just now especially, well, he can do you after you're married." She waited a moment, then went on. "By the way, I had a visit from Matty the other day. She turned up here last Sunday, and with Bertha Dorset, of all people in the world." She paused again to measure the effect of this announcement on her hearer, but the brush in Miss Bart's lifted hand maintained its unwavering stroke from brow to nape. "I never was more astonished," Miss Fisher pursued. "I don't know two women less predestined to intimacy, from Bertha's standpoint, that is, for of course poor Matty thinks it's natural enough that she should be singled out. I've no doubt the rabbit always thinks it is fascinating, the Aconda. Well, you know, I've always told you that Matty secretly longed to bore herself with the really fashionable, and now that chance has come. I see that she's capable of sacrificing all her old friends to it." Lily laid aside her brush and turned a penetrating glance upon her friend. "Including me?" she suggested. "Ah, my dear," murmured Mrs. Fisher, rising to push back a log from the hearth. "That's what Bertha means, isn't it?" Miss Bart went on steadily. "For, of course, she always means something, and before I left Long Island I saw that she was beginning to lay her toils for Matty." Mrs. Fisher sighed evasively. "She has her fast now, at any rate, to think that loud independence of Matty's being only a subtler form of snobbishness. Bertha can already make her believe anything she pleases, and I'm afraid she's begun, my poor child, by insinuating horrors about you." Lily flushed under the shadow of her drooping hair. "The world is too vile," she murmured, averting herself from Miss Fisher's anxious scrutiny. "It's not a pretty place, and the only way to keep a footing in it is to fight it on its own terms. And above all, my dear, not alone." Miss Fisher gathered up her floating implications in a resolute grasp. "You've told me so little that I can only guess what's been happening. But in the rush we all live in, there's no time to keep on hating any one without a cause. And if Bertha is still nasty enough to want to injure you with other people, it must be because she's still afraid of you. From her standpoint, there's only one reason for being afraid of you, and my own idea is, if you want to punish her, you hold the means in your hand. I believe you can marry George Dorset tomorrow, but if you don't care for that particular form of retaliation, the only thing to save you from Bertha is to marry somebody else." End of Chapter 6 of Book 2 of The House of Mrth.